What if the most famous story of liberation in human history doesn't actually begin with freedom? What if the book you call Exodus isn't even called that in the original language it was written in? And what if the real name of this book reveals something so personal, so dangerous to ignore, that it changes everything you thought you knew about how God delivers his people? There's a reason the Bible doesn't start this story with miracles. There's a reason it doesn't open with plagues, or a sea splitting in half, or even Moses standing before Pharaoh. It starts with something far more disturbing, something most people never notice, something that, if you really understand it, makes you realize that God's way of saving people is completely backwards from what religion teaches. And if you've ever felt invisible, forgotten, like just another face in the crowd, this might be the most important truth you'll ever hear. Because what comes next isn't just ancient history, it's how God sees you right now. Here's what they don't tell you in church. The second book of the Bible, the one with the parting of the Red Sea, the burning bush, the Ten Commandments, is called Exodus in English. But that's not what it's called in Hebrew, not even close. In fact, the word Exodus doesn't appear anywhere in the original text. It's a Greek word, added later by translators who wanted to name the book after the event they thought was most important: the escape, the departure, the Exodus. But here's the problem. That's not how God named it. And the difference between what God called this book and what we call it reveals something most Bible teachers won't touch. Because if they did, they'd have to admit that modern Christianity has completely misunderstood what liberation actually means. We think freedom is about circumstances changing. God says it's about something else entirely. We think deliverance is about getting out. God says it starts with something far more personal. And the strangest part, the answer has been sitting right there in the first sentence of the book. For 3,500 years, in plain sight in the original Hebrew, and almost no one talks about it. Why? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand what this book is really called, and why it's called that, everything changes. Your view of Scripture changes. Your view of salvation changes. Your view of how God operates changes. And honestly, that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But if you're hungry for biblical truths, most people overlook truths that cut through religion and get to the heart of who God really is. Then subscribe, because what we're about to uncover doesn't just challenge tradition, it rewrites it. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning we think we know, the real one. Open your Bible to Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. In English, it reads, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt." Simple enough, right? A list of names, a genealogy, the kind of passage most people skim over to get to the good stuff, the plagues, the miracles, the action. But here's what you need to understand. In the Hebrew Bible, books aren't named by their themes. They're named by their opening words. Genesis, in Hebrew, it's called Bereshit, in the beginning, because that's how it starts. Leviticus, in Hebrew, it's Vayikra, and he called, because that's the first significant word. This isn't random. This is intentional. The ancient scribes who preserved these texts understood something we've forgotten. The first words of a book set the tone for everything that follows. They're not just an introduction, they're a key. So when you open the book we call Exodus, and you see those first words in Hebrew, Va'ele Shemvot, Ve'ele Shemot, and these are the names. That's not just a transition from Genesis, that's the title of the book. The book isn't called Exodus in Hebrew, it's called Shemot, names, not the great escape, not the story of liberation, not how God delivered Israel from slavery, just names. Now here's where it gets interesting. The book that tells the story of the most dramatic national deliverance in biblical history, the Passover, the plagues, the pillar of fire, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, starts by listing names, not miracles, not prophecies, not divine interventions, names, 12 names specifically, the sons of Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph. And then it tells you how many people each family grew into. 70 souls total, a small clan, a family. And here's the question no one asks. Why? Why does the book of Liberation begin with a genealogy? Why does God start the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt by reminding us of who these people were before anything happened to them? What does identity have to do with deliverance? And here's the part that should bother you. If you keep reading, you'll notice that by Exodus chapter 1 verse 6, all those names, Joseph, his brothers, that entire generation, they're all dead, gone. And then verse 7 says, "But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." In other words, the people who knew their names, who remembered who they were, who had a personal connection to the promise God made to Abraham, they're gone. And what's left is a multitude, a crowd, an anonymous mass of slaves. Verse 8, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." He didn't know Joseph. He didn't know the names. He didn't know the people. To Pharaoh, they were just labor, bodies, a threat to be managed. And that's when the oppression begins. That's when the slavery intensifies. That's when Egypt starts trying to crush them. But here's what you need to catch. The book doesn't start with the oppression. It starts with the names. Because before God does anything, before he sends Moses, before he strikes Egypt with plagues, before he splits the sea, he reminds you, these aren't just slaves, they're people, with names, with identities, with a history, and he knows every single one of them. So the question becomes, what does that mean? Why does it matter that God begins the story of deliverance by emphasizing individual identity in a narrative that's clearly about a national event? What's the connection between names and freedom? And why has almost no one ever taught you this? Let's go deeper. In Hebrew culture, a name isn't just a label. It's not like today where we pick names because they sound nice or honor a relative. In the ancient world, especially in Israel, a name carried weight. It revealed character. It declared destiny. It was a prophecy embedded in a person's identity. When God changed Abram's name to Abraham, it wasn't cosmetic. It meant father of many nations. It was a promise built into his identity. When Jacob wrestled with God and his name was changed to Israel, it meant he struggles with God. It defined his relationship with the divine for the rest of his life. Names mattered. So when the book of Exodus opens with, "And these are the names," it's not filler. It's a statement. God is saying, before I tell you about what I did, I'm going to tell you who I did it for. And here's the part that should shake you. God didn't forget. Look at Exodus 2:24-25. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. 3 verbs: heard, remembered, acknowledged. That word acknowledged in Hebrew is yada. It means to know intimately, personally, deeply. It's the same word used in Genesis 4:1. Adam knew Eve and she conceived. It's not distant knowledge, it's relational knowledge, personal knowledge. God didn't just know about Israel, he knew Israel by name, person by person. And that's when he moved. Not before, not when the slavery started, not when the oppression got worse, but when he remembered the covenant. When he saw them not as a faceless mass, but as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people he knew by name. And here's where it gets wild. When God calls Moses at the burning bush, what does he say? Exodus 3:4. Moses, Moses. He says his name twice. Why? Because God doesn't deal with generic humanity. He deals with individuals. He calls people by name. Later in Exodus 33:17, God says to Moses, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. There it is again. By name. Not I know your role, not I know your function, not I know your position in the plan. I know you. And this brings us to something most people miss entirely. The book of Exodus isn't just about Israel leaving Egypt. It's about God revealing that he doesn't operate through systems. He operates through people. He doesn't liberate movements. He liberates persons. And the proof is right there in the structure of the book. Before the miracles, before the plagues, before the parting of the sea, names. So now the question becomes, if God's way of delivering people is rooted in personal knowledge, in knowing them by name, what does that mean for how we understand salvation today? Have you ever noticed this before? Because if you haven't, you're not alone. Most sermons focus on the event of the Exodus, but the text focuses on the people. And that gap between what we emphasize and what God emphasizes, that's where the mystery deepens. Here's where this stops being just ancient history, because the tension between names and namelessness, between being known personally versus being part of a faceless crowd, that's not just an Exodus problem, it's your problem. Think about the world you live in. You're not a person to most systems. You're a number, a social security number, a customer ID, a username, a follower count. A metric. To the algorithm, you're data. To the corporation, you're a demographic. To the government, you're a statistic. You're useful, but you're not known. And deep down, you feel it. You feel the weight of being seen, but not recognized. Noticed, but not valued. Counted, but not called. And here's the devastating part. Even in religious spaces, even in church, you can feel like just another seat in the crowd. Another tithe, another attendee, another soul to add to the membership roll. Because modern Christianity has adopted the same system the world uses: growth, numbers, expansion. We measure success by how many people show up, not by how deeply they're known. We build mega churches, mega ministries, mega movements, and somewhere along the way we forgot that Jesus never pastored a crowd. He pastored 12 men, by name. And when he spoke to multitudes, he still saw individuals. The woman at the well, he knew her story. Zacchaeus in the tree, he called him by name. Blind Bartimaeus, he stopped for one man crying out. Over and over you see it. God's method is not mass production. It's personal attention. And that's what makes Exodus 1 so radical, because God could have started the story with, and there were 600,000 Israelite men in Egypt, plus women and children. He could have opened with the big number, the impressive statistic, the size of the movement. But he didn't. He started with 12 names, 70 people, a family. Because to God, size doesn't matter, identity does. Now connect this to something Jesus said in the New Testament, Matthew 10:29-31. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. The hairs on your head are numbered, not just counted, known. God doesn't operate in generalities. He operates in specifics. He knows the exact number of hairs you have, and if he's that attentive to something as insignificant as hair, how much more does he know you, by name, by story, by struggle, by secret? And here's where the book of Shemot becomes a mirror. Because just like Israel in Egypt, you've probably felt what it's like to be nameless in a system that only sees you as labor. You've felt the weight of being reduced to your function, your productivity, your usefulness. And when you stop being useful, you're discarded. That's Egypt. That's the spirit of Pharaoh. That's the world system. But God's first move toward deliverance isn't to change your circumstances. It's to remind you of your name, your identity, who you are before you do anything. Isaiah 43:1 says it perfectly. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. Notice the order. First, I have called you by your name. Then, you are mine. Then, redemption. Belonging comes before deliverance. Identity comes before liberation. God doesn't free anonymous slaves. He redeems known children. And this is why the book is called Shemot, because freedom doesn't start when you leave Egypt. It starts when you remember whose you are. But here's the tension you have to sit with. If God knows you by name, if he sees you as an individual, not a statistic, if his method is deeply personal, relational, and specific to you, then why does it so often feel like he's distant? Why does it feel like you're just another prayer request, another cry for help lost in the noise? Why does it feel like you're waiting and waiting and waiting for a breakthrough that never comes? And this is where Exodus gets uncomfortable, because if you keep reading, you'll notice something disturbing. God heard Israel's groaning for 400 years before he moved. 4 centuries, generations lived and died in slavery. And God knew their names the entire time. So what does that mean? Does God's personal knowledge of you guarantee immediate deliverance? Or is there something deeper happening? Something about timing, something about process, something about the difference between being known and being ready. Because here's what Exodus 1 reveals. Before God brought Israel out of Egypt, he made sure they multiplied. Verse 7 says, they increased abundantly and grew exceedingly mighty. And they went from 70 people to over 2 million. In slavery, God allowed them to grow in the place of oppression before he brought them out. Why? Because deliverance isn't just about leaving something. It's about being strong enough to sustain freedom once you have it. And that's a truth most people don't want to hear, because we want instant deliverance, instant breakthrough, instant freedom. But God's way is, I know you by name, and I'm preparing you for something bigger than you realize. And that preparation often happens in Egypt, in the waiting, in the pressure, in the place where you feel forgotten. But you're not forgotten. You're known by name. And the God who knows your name also knows your timing. So the question becomes, what's the connection between being known and being delivered? And why does the book that tells the greatest liberation story in history begin with something as quiet and personal as names? We're getting close to the answer. But we're not there yet. Here's what it all comes down to. The reason God named this book Shemot, names, instead of Exodus or deliverance or the great escape, is because he's making a point that undermines every religious system that's ever existed. God doesn't save crowds. He saves people, one by one, by name. And if you miss that, you miss everything. Because religion is obsessed with size, with growth, with numbers. We count attendance. We measure impact by how many people we reach. We build platforms, campaigns, movements, all focused on scale. But God starts with 12 names, and he builds from there. Not because he can't work with multitudes, but because he chooses to work through individuals. Look at the entire structure of Scripture. God doesn't call a nation and then pick a leader. He calls a person and builds a nation through them. Abraham, one man. Moses, one man. David, one man. Every major movement of God in the Bible starts with a single individual who hears their name called. And here's why that matters in Exodus. When Israel was enslaved in Egypt, they had lost their identity. They had become labor, nameless, faceless, oppressed. Pharaoh didn't see them as people. He saw them as a threat, a population to control. And that's the strategy of every oppressive system. Strip people of their names, reduce them to numbers, make them forget who they are. Because once you forget your name, Once you lose your sense of identity, you become controllable, you become manageable, you stop resisting. That's why Exodus 1 matters so much. Because before God does anything to confront Pharaoh, before he sends plagues, before he parts the sea, before he gives the law, he reminds them, you have names. You're not just slaves. You're the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're not an accident. You're part of a covenant. You're not forgotten. You're known. And that changes everything, because once you know your name, once you remember your identity, you can't be enslaved the same way anymore. The chains are still there, the taskmasters are still brutal, the work is still crushing, but internally, you're free, because you know who you are, and you know whose you are. This is why Exodus 6:6-7 is so critical. God says to Moses, therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Notice, I will take you as my people. Not, I will take you as my labor force. Not, I will take you as my army. My people. Personal, relational, covenantal. God doesn't deliver slaves so they can be free. He delivers his people so they can belong to him. There's a massive difference. And this is what the world doesn't understand about biblical freedom. The world thinks freedom is the absence of authority. God says freedom is being under the right authority. The world says freedom is doing whatever you want. God says freedom is knowing whose you are. And that's why the book is called Shemot, because deliverance begins with identity. You can't be free if you don't know your name. You can't walk out of bondage if you've forgotten who you were created to be. And God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that. So he didn't start with spectacle. He started with names: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. He started with identity, with covenant, with relationship, and then, and only then, did he move in power. Because liberation that isn't rooted in identity is just relocation. You leave one Egypt and build another. But liberation rooted in knowing whose you are, that's transformation. That's freedom that lasts. Now connect this to your life. How many times have you cried out for deliverance from something, a situation, a struggle, a bondage, and it felt like God wasn't moving? How many times have you felt like just another voice in the wilderness, another prayer that goes unanswered? What if the delay isn't because God doesn't care? What if it's because he's doing something deeper than you realize? What if, before he changes your circumstances, he's reminding you of your name, your identity, your place in his covenant? Because once you know that, once you really deeply understand that God knows you by name, that you're not forgotten, that you're not invisible, the circumstances become secondary. The Egypt you're in stops defining you. Because you know who you are, you know whose you are, and that truth sets you free long before you ever leave the place of oppression. This is why Jesus could stand in the wilderness, tempted by Satan, and say, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He knew his identity. He knew his name. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And because he knew that, the temptation had no power. The same is true for you. The reason the enemy works so hard to make you feel nameless, invisible, forgotten, insignificant, is because he knows the moment you remember your name, the moment you remember whose you are, everything changes. And that's what Shemot is about. Not just Israel's story, yours. So here's where we land. The book you call Exodus is actually called Shemot, names. And that's not a mistranslation. It's a revelation. God begins the story of the most famous deliverance in human history by reminding you he doesn't deal with statistics. He deals with people, by name. And if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever felt like just another number in a broken system, if you've ever wondered if God even sees you, the answer is in the first verse of this book. And these are the names. He knows, he sees, he hasn't forgotten. And the deliverance he's planning for you isn't just about changing your situation. It's about reminding you of your identity. Because freedom doesn't start when the chains break. It starts when you remember whose you are. The world will always try to reduce you, to categorize you, to number you, to make you feel replaceable. But God calls you by name. Isaiah 43:1. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. That's not ancient history. That's right now. God is speaking your name, not the name the world gave you, not the label religion put on you, not the identity shame whispered over you. Your real name, the one he knew before you were born, the one he's been calling all along. And once you hear it, once you really hear it, everything shifts. The Egypt you're in loses its power because you know who you are, and you know whose you are. So the question isn't, when will God deliver me? The question is, do I know my name? Because the God who named this book Shemot, the God who began the story of liberation with a list of names, is the same God who knows your name, and he's calling it right now. The only question is, are you listening? If this changed how you see Scripture, share it, because the world talks about multitudes, but God talks about names. And that truth, that simple, profound, life-altering truth, is something everyone needs to hear.